Hi, this is Senator Jason Lewis. This brief presentation will explain how the Massachusetts school funding formula works and why we need to fix it. So let's start with what the goals of the school funding formula are. In Massachusetts, it's actually enshrined in the state constitution that every child should have access to a quality public education. In fact, our state constitution uses the word cherish. So the school funding formula, which was designed as part of the Education Reform Act in 1993, is to ensure that every school district, regardless of a particular community's wealth or income level, is adequately and equitably funded so that every community is able to provide its students with a high quality education. So how does the formula work? Well, there's sort of three main steps to it. This is a little bit of a simplification, but generally does accurately describe what the formula does. The first step is to calculate what's known as the foundation budget. And this is what is considered to be an adequate level of funding for a school district given the specific enrollment in that district and demographic characteristics. So for example, a district that has a higher number of students that are English learners or has a higher number of students that are economically disadvantaged would have a higher foundation budget than a wealthier district. The second step then is to calculate the local contribution. And that is the share of the foundation budget that has to be contributed from an individual city or town's own resources. And that is determined based upon the wealth of a particular community. So in other words, wealthier communities are expected to contribute more toward the education of their students than less affluent communities. And then finally, step three, as you might expect, the state then makes up the difference between the foundation budget and the local contribution with what is known as Chapter 70 aid. So let's look at this a little bit more closely. Again, the first step being the calculation of the foundation budget. And there is actually a complicated spreadsheet, just like the one on this slide, that is calculated by the Department of Education for each school district. And it looks at the different costs that go into providing an education, obviously teachers, curriculum, professional development, employee benefits, and so on. And then it calculates what those costs are across all the different categories of students, from pre-kindergarten all the way up to high school. And then what the foundation budget does is it adds extra resources, what's known as an increment, for two types of students, for English learners and for economically disadvantaged students. So you can actually go online on the Department of Education's website and you can see the foundation budget for your own school district if you would like. And then, of course, the third step, the state is then making up the difference with Chapter 70 aid. And as you can see on this slide, we've got a random group of cities and towns here. In the case of Lawrence, which is a less wealthy community, the state is providing more Chapter 70 aid, as you'd expect. Then in the case of the town of Natick, which is a more affluent community, there the state is contributing less of the total school spending. Now, the problem with the school funding formula and the reason why it needs to be fixed is because the foundation budget, which was developed, as I said, in 1993, has not kept up with actual increases in costs. And this is notwithstanding the fact that there is an inflation adjustment made each year to the foundation budget. Even so, because of the high growth in particular types of costs, most notably health insurance and special education, the foundation budget today significantly underestimates what the actual costs are to provide a quality education to our students. So you can see here on this slide, the blue bars are the statewide foundation budget, first for health insurance, then for in-district special education, and then for out-of-district special education. And the orange bars are the actual amount that our school districts are spending in these categories. And as you can see, the actual spending far outweighs what the foundation budget says should be sufficient. And this adds up to anywhere from $1 to $2 billion that the foundation budget is underestimating actual costs. As a result of this, we are seeing growing inequity across districts. And what that means is that wealthier districts are able to spend a lot more to educate their students than are economically disadvantaged districts. And this was the exact problem that the Education Reform Act in the early 1990s sought to address by trying to make sure, as we discussed earlier, that every community would have the resources it needs to provide a great education to its students. So as you can see in this particular slide, we have chosen two communities here to compare. Chelsea, which is a higher poverty community, and Watertown, which is a more affluent community. You can see in both cases we have the foundation budget on the left. The foundation budget is higher for Chelsea, as you would expect, because Chelsea has a greater number of students who are English language learners, and they have a higher percentage of students that are economically disadvantaged. Then the next step is you can see that Chelsea is required to contribute significantly less per student than is Watertown, again, as you would expect, because they have less capacity to raise revenues. The state is then making up the difference with Chapter 78, and that is getting both communities basically to their foundation budget level. The problem, of course, as we've already discussed, is that's inadequate to meet the educational needs of the students. So Chelsea tries hard to kick in a little bit of extra funding, but they are very limited in their capacity to do so, and therefore only are able to provide $747 more per student. Watertown, on the other hand, has much greater local resources, and so they're able to provide almost $9,000 more per student. And therefore, as a result, Chelsea spends $13,232 per student on average. Watertown spends $19,789 per student and is spending more money to educate a student population that has a smaller number of high needs students than does Chelsea. So this type of inequity is now being played out across many of our districts in Massachusetts. In order to address this, the problems in the school funding formula, the legislature a number of years ago created the Foundation Budget Review Commission. And this commission was bipartisan. It consisted of teachers and superintendents and all kinds of stakeholders who spent about a year holding public hearings and analyzing data on school finance. They published a report in 2015, which is online, and you can read that report. I encourage you to read that report. And they recommended that in order to fix the school funding formula, the foundation budget needs to be updated in four main areas. First, health insurance. Second, special education. Third, the additional increment for English learners. And fourth, the additional increment that is provided for low-income students. So where we are now is that the legislature has been working to implement the recommendations of the Foundation Budget Review Commission for several years. In fact, both the House and Senate have previously passed legislation to do so, but unfortunately have not yet been able to get a final bill onto the desk of Governor Baker. The Education Committee is in the process of considering a number of legislative proposals to implement the recommendations of the FBRC. We are gathering stakeholder feedback from all across Massachusetts. For example, we held a day-long hearing at the State House last month to take testimony on these bills. And both Representative Peisch, the House co-chair of the committee, and myself have been visiting school districts together and meeting with many different stakeholders to continue to get feedback on what we need to do to fix the foundation budget and the school funding formula. Both the House and the Senate, as well as Governor Baker, have all said that education funding reform is a top priority this year. And so I am very hopeful that we will be able to achieve consensus on the best way forward and to have legislation passed into law, hopefully in the very near future.